The railing was slick with salt when her hands finally slipped, and the scream she never finished was swallowed whole by the ocean. Moments later, crimson spread across Monterey Bay, soft and slow like smoke unfurling under glass, while dozens of stunned passengers could only watch in silence. A camera floated back to the surface, its lens shattered, its strap torn, the only trace of Samantha Cole left above the water. People still argue whether it was an accident or something far older than we're willing to admit. But what happened out there refuses to fade. If these moments pull you closer to the truth hidden beneath the waves, stay with us and share the story so it can be remembered beyond the tide. The morning air over Monterey Bay carried a deceptive softness, the kind of calm that makes people believe the ocean is a place that wants them. From the pier at Pacific Horizon Marine Sanctuary, the tour vessel idled with a low mechanical purr, diesel threading through the colder scent of kelp and wet wood. Samantha Cole, 37, wildlife photographer from Colorado with fair skin, sea-green eyes, and auburn hair braided tight beneath a faded cap, stepped onto the damp deck and felt the grit of dried salt under her boots. She hugged her worn Canon to her chest, the way some people cradle a keepsake, then slung it to her shoulder and ran a chamois over the lens until it squeaked. A gull cut a white line across the sky, somewhere below the pier. A buoy bell chimed once, a clean strike of metal on metal that seemed to bless the departure. She moved to the bow without waiting to be told, fingers sliding along the cold rail as the boat eased away from the dock. Families clustered midship, passing out granola bars and plastic binoculars, a child banging the tube against the rail until a parent shushed him. A retired couple stood shoulder to shoulder in matching windbreakers, their cheeks already pink from the breeze. The bay lay glassy and obedient, sunlight skating across a surface too smooth to be trusted. Samantha dialed in settings out of habit ISO 400 for the bright water, shutter 1000 to freeze a breach if it happened. F8 for safety, then lowered the camera and simply watched. It was the color of the water that got to her first, a blue so clear it showed the drag marks of kelp fronds under the skin, a blue that pretended it had nothing to hide. First trip, a deckhand asked, stepping around a coil of wet rope. His jacket smelled like salt and patch glue. First time for orcas, Samantha said. Everything else feels like practice. He smiled without teeth and moved on. A voice over the PA rattled through the speakers. Routine safety. Life vests. Keep fingers inside the rails. No feeding wildlife, each sentence swallowed by the wind at the edges. The boat's wake unrolled behind them, like a white seam, stitched across the glitter. On shore, the buildings of Cannery Row shrank into a watercolor strip, the smell of sunscreen from the family behind her giving way to the deeper brine of open water. Samantha exhaled slowly, tasting salt at the back of her throat. She raised the viewfinder and framed the horizon line, held it like a promise, then let the camera fall again, the strap digging a familiar groove across her collarbone. She kept working, because work steadied her. She checked the spare batteries in her jacket pocket, tapped the memory card door to be sure it latched, tugged the hood of her rain shell against a wind that sliced colder than it looked. A harbor seal surfaced off starboard with a wet pop and a curious snort, whiskers dripping, then vanished like a pulled coin. The boat's hull ticked as it settled into a slightly faster speed. Samantha opened her notebook with stiff fingers and jotted a line in cramped block letters, light harsh but clean. Kelp visible, good contrast on dorsal. The sanctuary waters widened. Every sound seemed precise out here, the slap of a loose halyard against an aluminum mast, the distant bark of a sea lion on a buoy, the whisper of spray flaring up and falling away. People fell quiet the farther they went. Even the child with the binoculars stopped banging and pressed the lenses to his face as if they could summon a miracle. Samantha felt the same pull, a hush that began in the throat and worked its way down to the ribs. She'd told friends she came for the photograph, but standing there, she understood it was something smaller and harder to articulate the desire to be present the moment the world revealed itself without being asked. A smudge of dark rose on the waterline far out, then thinned and disappeared. Samantha blinked, leaned forward, and braced her boot against the raised lip of the deck to steady herself against the boat's subtle yaw. Wind pushed damp strands of hair loose from her braid, plastering them against her cheek. She licked the salt from her mouth, lifted the camera again, and scanned, panning left until the muscles along her forearm burned. Nothing, only swell and light and the trick mirror of a flat sea. Behind her, laughter flared a quick, bright burst like a match and died just as quickly. The captain throttled back a fraction. The change in engine tone registered in her bones before it reached her ears. Samantha tracked a line of shearwaters skimming low, wingtips ticking the surface. She waited the way she'd learned to wait in high meadows and marsh blinds and winter timber without fidgeting, without bargaining, ready to accept the possibility of going home empty as part of the cost of coming at all. The first strike of breath reached them before any fin did a heavy exhale, like a tire unsealing, fogging the air in a ghostly column that drifted, broke, and disappeared. Gasps lifted from the deck, soft and automatic. Then the sound came again. Exhale, inhale, the mechanical intimacy of lungs drawing and releasing ocean air. Samantha felt her own breath fall into cadence with it. She steadied the lens. The water ahead trembled, as if something passing just below touched its underside with an unseen hand. A black triangle cleaved the surface, clean, shining, larger than she expected, a dorsal fin rising in a long, deliberate arc. The hull vibrated with footsteps as people rushed to the rail, the deckhand calling for space. Samantha kept her stance at the bow and tracked the movement until it slid back under. Another fin appeared 50 yards off, then a smaller one traveling in tight parallel. She pressed the shutter twice, 3 times, not because she wanted to look at the photos later, but because the sound tethered her to something she understood. The smell shifted sharper, brinier, tinged with the faint iron edge that sometimes rose from kelp beds when they were cut. She didn't notice the torn tip at first. It was the stillness that drew her the way one fin stopped and held in a slick of flat water, while the others rolled and disappeared and returned. Then, as the boat drifted on, she saw the ragged wedge missing from the dorsal's trailing edge, a notch like a bite taken from a blade. The fin held, the body below it motionless in a patience she felt rather than saw. "There," she said aloud, not realizing she'd spoken. The retired couple leaned in, following her line of sight. The man whispered, "Old fighter," like he was talking about a boxer. Samantha lowered the camera until the world came back without glass. The ambient noise of the vessel, a rattle here, a hum there seemed to pull away. She could hear the wind worrying the seams of her hood, the sticky note flap of a map on the wheelhouse window, the faint ring of that harbor bell far behind them, carrying over smooth water. She slid her fingers along the rail and felt the cold film of spray slick under her palm. Beneath the skin warmth of her glove, the metal was biting. The fin sank and was gone. She searched. A minute stretched. 2. The child started to whimper and was hushed with a promise of hot chocolate when they got back in. Samantha lifted her chin and breathed in through her nose until she tasted copper. She glanced toward the captain's house, where a figure moved behind glass, spoke into a handset, and pointed ahead. The boat slowed again, then drifted with the swell, tipping on a rhythm so measured it felt rehearsed. When the Orca surfaced next, it did so with a part of its head showing just enough eye to be seen. The water smoothed around that single dark orb. She registered it the way the body registers pain before the brain can name it: a compression in the chest, a tightening at the base of her skull, the reflexive urge to take a step back that her boots refused. She did not press the shutter. She did not blink. The eye held so perfectly still that it made the living water look like glass, for a heartbeat longer than she wanted. The gaze seemed to settle, not over the boat, not past them, but on a fixed point that required her to accept it was her. The exhale came close enough that she felt it on her cheek, a warm, damp brush against her skin that left a faint smell of fish and salt lodged in her throat. The eye slipped under before she could find breath, all around her. People started talking again, low, amazed, relieved, yet their voices seemed to come from someplace behind a closed door. Samantha lifted the camera halfway and let it hang again, the strap biting deeper as if to remind her not to drop it. She turned her head to look back toward the harbor and saw only the bright stripe of morning widening across the water, the bell too far now to be heard. Forward. The bay's surface had gone unnaturally smooth, a lane of polished steel laid before the bow. Samantha set her feet, shoulders squared against a chill that had nothing to do with the wind, and waited for the water to move. It did not. Then, off the starboard side, the torn fin rose once more and stopped dead, holding so long the sunlight glazed it like lacquer. Somewhere under that fin, a single black eye lifted to the surface and did not blink. The boat drifted farther into Monterey Bay, its wake stretching thin across the glassy water. Daniel Hayes, 45. The veteran guide, whose face was lined from years of wind and salt, stood near the center of the deck. His voice carried with the ease of someone who knew both the sea and the people who came seeking it. "Remember," he said, steady and sure, "there's never been a recorded attack on a human by wild orcas. They are hunters, yes, but not of us." The reassurance rippled through the passengers like a warm tide. Shoulders loosened, voices lifted, even children pressed their faces closer to the rails without fear. Samantha Cole let herself breathe easier, the words nesting in her chest. For a moment, she believed this sanctuary meant safety, a boundary that nature itself respected. The day had turned radiant, the sun flaring off the surface in sharp flashes that stung the eyes. Cameras snapped like insects, capturing slick black backs arching from the sea. A mother and calf surfaced together, their twin exhales erupting in silver mist that drifted into the sky. Laughter followed, bright and unguarded, like bells rung over water. The air was a blend of sunscreen, wet metal, and salt, layered into the kind of sensory haze that could convince anyone they were safe here. Samantha lifted her cannon, her finger trembling with anticipation. Through the lens, the ocean felt like a cathedral vaulted, sacred, untouchable. Then Ragnar appeared. His dorsal fin rose closer than before, scarred and torn at the tip, stark against the mirror of the bay. It carried none of the gentle rhythm of the others. It cut the water like a knife raised, deliberate, declaring itself. Gasps erupted, then applause, as though the scar were a badge of triumph, not a warning. A teenager clapped, calling out, "Look at that beast." Another shouted for Ragnar to come closer. Samantha steadied her lens, heart tightening, her breath shallow. She whispered his name under her breath. Though she didn't know why, she gave the whale that weight. Her stomach clenched as Ragnar's body slid beneath the boat with a force that made the deck shiver. Daniel raised his voice again, calm, but firmer this time. "Stay balanced. Don't lean too far. They know what they're doing out there." Passengers nodded, reassured once more, but Samantha's eyes stayed locked on the scar. The water trembled where he vanished, the surface tightening like fabric pulled too taut. She felt her ribs close in around her lungs, a quiet unease threading itself into her bones. She lowered the camera, unable to take the shot. Around her, the crowd still celebrated, oblivious. A child squealed when another pair surfaced, spray catching the light like confetti. A woman lifted her phone high, laughing as droplets peppered her hair. Samantha forced herself to smile at their joy, but it cracked at the edges. The laughter no longer sounded like bells, it rang too sharp, too hollow, a sound unfit for the silence waiting below. Ragnar surfaced once more, just off the bow. His dorsal fin towered, black water dripping from its edges. The air stilled, as though even the gulls had stopped their crying. Samantha's throat dried. She leaned closer to the rail, voice barely audible. "He didn't stop when I called." The words shook as they left her, trembling into the wind. No one around her seemed to hear. Only the water did, trembling again as Ragnar dove, leaving the surface quaking in his wake. The boat rocked ever so slightly, though the sea itself lay nearly flat. Passengers steadied their footing, some thinking it was just the swell shifting beneath them. But Samantha felt the vibration differently, tight, deliberate, like something striking the hull from below. A metallic thud reverberated underfoot, faint yet unmistakable, rattling through the soles of her boots. It was not the roll of the tide, it was contact. She gripped her camera strap until it dug painfully into her shoulder. Around her, a cluster of young men near the stern broke into laughter, their bravado cutting through the hush that had fallen over the others. One pursed his lips and let out a shrill, mocking whistle, imitating the bark of a seal. Another leaned low, slapping his open palm against the surface of the water, splashing toward the dark shapes circling beneath. "Come on, show us something," he yelled. His friend tossed half a sandwich overboard, the bread bobbing briefly before dissolving in the salt. Samantha's chest tightened with a cold, sharp anger. She whispered, "Don't." Her voice raw, but the sound was lost to the wind and the men's careless amusement. Daniel Hayes stepped forward, his face set like stone, back from the rail. "Now," he said, his tone clipped, the voice of someone used to being obeyed at sea. The men rolled their eyes but stepped back with exaggerated shrugs, their laughter thinning into mutters. The air thickened, the smell of diesel exhaust mixed with sea spray, carrying a sharpness that stung the back of Samantha's throat. The sky hadn't changed, yet the light felt dimmer, the way it does when storm clouds wait just beyond the horizon, beneath the water. Ragnar's body slid like a dark blade, his massive form cutting the sea in wide arcs. With each pass, his circle grew tighter. His movements were not random, they had the precision of a predator testing boundaries. Passengers leaned in uneasily now, their cameras lowered. The earlier chorus of clicks and chatter fell away until the only sounds were the churn of the engines idling and the slow creak of the deck. A woman clutched her child's wrist, pulling him back a step from the rail. Even the gulls circling above seemed to grow silent, drifting without a cry. Ragnar surfaced suddenly, his dorsal fin rising with a stark gleam, water cascading from its scarred edge. For an instant, his black eye broke the surface. It was not the vacant gaze of an animal unaware. It locked, still and cold, holding itself above the waterline longer than necessary. Samantha swore she felt the air turn colder around her, a chill that raised the hairs at the back of her neck. Her pulse surged, pounding against her ribs. The strap of her camera seemed to grow heavier, the lens useless in her shaking hands. The boat rocked again, this time sharper. A gasp rippled through the passengers. "It's nothing," one of the young men muttered nervously, his earlier bravado thinning, but his voice faltered as Ragnar's shadow passed directly beneath the bow. The water itself seemed to tighten, its surface trembling with suppressed energy. Samantha could not look away. Her lips parted, her voice barely audible. This isn't curiosity. She felt it deep inside her bones, the way one recognizes the difference between thunder in the distance and the crack of lightning striking nearby. Ragnar was not playing. He was measuring, rehearsing, preparing. The laughter had stopped completely. Even the men at the stern stood rigid, their faces pale now, eyes searching the water for something they no longer wanted to see. A silence fell over the deck. Not reverence, not awe, something heavier, like a warning pressing against the chest of every soul aboard. Ragnar's fin sliced the water one last time before vanishing into the deep, leaving behind a wake that shimmered unnaturally. The boat rocked once more, then settled, but the weight of his absence was worse than his presence. Samantha's hands trembled against the rail, her breath shallow. She knew without knowing how that the next time Ragnar surfaced, it would not be to circle. Night settled heavy over Pacific Horizon Marine Sanctuary. The vessel had returned to dock hours earlier, its passengers gone, their laughter and nervous chatter fading into the lights of Cannery Row. But in the crew quarters, the air still smelled of salt and diesel, sharp and unshakable. Samantha sat at a worn wooden table, her camera on the surface beside her, the lens streaked with dried spray. She rubbed her arms, chilled by the draft that snaked in through the cracked porthole. Across from her, Daniel Hayes leaned forward, elbows planted, his voice lowered almost to a whisper. "You need to understand," he said, staring at the grain of the table as though it held the memory itself. Ragnar wasn't always part of this tour. Years back, he broke free from a net outside Moss Landing. They tried to herd him back. He tore through 2 boats, injured a handler. Nothing fatal, but bad enough. We all knew his name after that. Samantha's pulse quickened, the hairs on her neck prickling. Why isn't that in the reports? Daniel's jaw tightened. Because it was buried. Tourists don't pay to hear about attacks. They called it unfortunate entanglement, blamed faulty gear. By the time it was written up, Ragnar was a footnote. The truth was drowned before it reached the shore. His eyes lifted at last, storm-creased and tired. He isn't just curious out there. He tests. He pushes. One old trainer used to say, he's always working the line between wild and captive. The words sank into Samantha like stones. She should have left it there, should have walked away. But devotion overpowered caution. For years, she had chased glimpses of the wild horns locked on tundra, wings frozen mid-flight. Orcas were her horizon. To capture Ragnar in his world would be the photograph she had dreamed of since childhood, proof not just of beauty, but of something untamed, beyond fences or glass. She ran her fingers across her camera, feeling the familiar grooves in its body. She imagined the image already Ragnar breaking the water, scarred fin against an iron sky. It was dangerous, but danger had always been part of why she came. Dawn broke pale and unforgiving. The bay was wrapped in a skin of steel-gray light, gulls circling above with shrill cries that sounded like warnings. The air smelled different, metallic, dense, as though charged with something waiting to erupt. Passengers gathered on the dock, smiling, chatter rising in clouds of breath. They carried thermoses and cameras, oblivious, eager for another day on the water. Samantha stood among them, her camera strap already biting her shoulder, heart steady but quickened by an undercurrent of dread. Daniel moved about the deck in silence, his orders clipped, his glance cutting more often toward the open water than toward the crowd. He looked older that morning, the weight of memory pressing his shoulders low. Samantha caught his eye once, but neither spoke. As the vessel eased away from the dock, the engine's thrum pulsed like a warning beneath their feet. The horizon spread wide, iron-colored, the gulls still screaming as if they knew something that people refused to hear. The sea was calm, but the calm felt wrong, like breath held too long. Then Ragnar surfaced, far off, his fin cutting briefly through the distance. He lingered just long enough for the scar to catch the dim light, then slid under again, vanishing into the deeper channel. The stage was set, the water holding its silence like a clenched jaw. Samantha raised her camera anyway, the lens finding the place where he had disappeared, her finger trembling over the shutter. The morning had turned dark in ways that had nothing to do with the hour. Low-gray clouds pressed down on Monterey Bay, flattening the horizon into a strip of steel. The Pacific Horizon vessel cut across the water, its white hull slick with spray. Passengers gathered at the rails, their phones raised, the hum of conversation threaded with nervous excitement. But the sea below them was wrong too flat, too still. A mirror stretched taut. Samantha Cole felt it before it happened, a heaviness in her ribs, the pulse in her neck beating hard against the cold air. She tightened her grip on the camera strap, but her hands were damp, trembling. The first strike came without warning. A violent jolt slammed into the hull with the sound of metal against stone. The boat lurched sideways, drinks spilled, and a steel thermos clattered across the deck, rolling into a child's ankle. Passengers collapsed against one another, grabbing for the slick railing. Screams tore into the salty air, raw and jagged. The vessel groaned under the impact, as though something alive pressed against its bones. Samantha dropped hard to her knees, the shock rattling through her spine. Her camera skidded across the boards, clattering against the wet steel lip of the bow. Water exploded upward on the starboard side. Ragnar surged alongside, his body massive and deliberate, scarred dorsal fin slicing up through the gray surface like a blade drawn from a sheath. The sound was thunder in water, crashing and swallowing every other noise. Spray hit Samantha's face, stinging her eyes, tasting of salt and iron. She gasped, but the sound was drowned by the roar of the sea. Daniel Hayes shouted above the chaos, his voice roughened to a command that cut through panic. "Get back! Hold on to something!" Crew members echoed him, trying to shove tourists away from the rails. Children sobbed, clutching at their parents, voices shrill against the hollow boom of water hitting hull. The air reeked of brine, of fear thick enough to taste. Then the second blow struck, this time at the stern. The impact ripped through the vessel, the deck tilting violently as though the entire boat had been lifted. People screamed, bodies sliding across the wet planks, hands clawing for balance. A tripod smashed to the deck and snapped in half. Someone's phone skidded through the runoff, sparks of glass fracturing across its screen. Samantha staggered to her feet, her knees slick with salt water and grit, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out the world. Ragnar broke the surface again, closer this time. His black eye breached, round and ancient, locking on her with a gaze that rooted her to the deck. For a moment, it was not fury she saw, it was recognition. She froze, breath caught sharp in her throat, her pulse hammering. Time fractured. The deck noise blurred into a muffled roar as that eye held hers. A fresh wave smashed against the bow. Samantha stumbled, reaching instinctively for the railing. Her hands found cold metal, slick with spray, her knuckles white as she clung. Daniel was still yelling, his voice torn raw. Inside, move inside. But the words were carried off by wind and panic. Ragnar circled, the scar on his fin bright against the churned surface. The final thrust came like a hammer. The boat bucked, shuddering with a force that rattled through its frame. Samantha's boots slipped on the drenched deck. Her grip faltered. The rail was slick. Betrayal under her palms. In a single breathless instant, she lost her hold, the world tilting beneath her. She fell. The ocean rose to meet her with shocking cold, swallowing her scream before it reached the air. The salt slammed into her lungs, the weight of water crushing in around her. From the deck above came shouts, frantic cries, Daniel's voice breaking her name, but all of it blurred, muffled, stolen by the sea. The deck was chaos, bodies stumbling, voices colliding into a wall of panic. Daniel Hayes shoved through the crowd toward the bow, his boots slipping on the slick boards. He reached for the rail with both hands, eyes locked on the white churn where Samantha had fallen. "Samantha," he shouted, but his voice was swallowed instantly by the roar of water. The surface frothed, then smoothed over as if nothing had ever broken it. For a heartbeat, there was only absence. Then Ragnar surfaced. The whale's immense body rose with chilling stillness, the scarred dorsal fin gleaming wet against the gray sky. His black eye lifted above the waterline, staring into nothing, or perhaps into everything. Then came the red. A bloom of crimson unfurled slowly beneath him, delicate at first, then spreading wider, like smoke curling in a glass. Gasps broke from passengers, but even those sounds faltered into silence. No one screamed anymore. The sharp scent of brine turned metallic, coppery, unmistakable, carried up in the spray. Crew members scrambled for radios, their voices cracking under strain. "Man overboard! Man overboard! We need rescue!" Now, the words trembled as they left their mouths, as though speaking them made the horror real. The captain barked commands from behind the wheel, but the hum of the engine felt small, fragile, useless against the immensity of the sea. A child sobbed, his cries muffled against his mother's soaked jacket. An older tourist, her rosary trembling in her hands, whispered broken prayers into the salt air. No one dared lean over the rails. The deck was littered with the detritus of panic phones abandoned, spilled drinks, a broken camera tripod lying like snapped bone. Daniel stood frozen, fists clenching the rail until his knuckles whitened. His eyes never left the water. Minutes dragged into an eternity. Divers weren't there, rescue boats too far. All they could do was watch the sea, willing it to give her back, but nothing returned. When the swell finally pushed something toward the hull, it wasn't Samantha. It was her camera, bobbing in the wake. A crewman hooked it with a pole, pulling it onto the deck. The lens was shattered, the strap frayed and torn as though ripped by something far stronger than water. Daniel bent to pick it up, his hands shaking, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Later, too late, the truth surfaced in fragments. An old handler's note stuffed in a forgotten file, emails written by staff months before, warning of Ragnar's aggression, warning of patterns no one wanted to acknowledge, reports stamped confidential, concerns brushed aside, sanitized for tourists. It hadn't been driftwood. It had never been an accident. Ragnar had always carried the mark of something darker, something dismissed until it found its moment. Daniel's lips moved, his voice barely audible, more to himself than anyone around him. This wasn't driftwood. This was him. His words hung heavy in the damp air. No one argued. No one dared. The ocean offered no reply, only silence, the kind that weighs, the kind that lingers. The news broke before the boat had even docked. By the time the Pacific Horizon vessel crept back into Monterey Harbor, silence pressing down on the deck, the story was already spreading across the internet and television feeds. Wildlife photographer lost at sea. One headline screamed, another softened it. Accident on Monterey Bay tour. The words bent, depending on who spoke them, but the weight was the same. A name had been taken by the ocean. Reporters crowded the marina, their microphones bobbing like buoys in the salt wind. Cameras snapped relentlessly, the click, click, click biting through the heavy quiet of the returning passengers. Families hurried down the gangway, blankets still wrapped around their shoulders, eyes hollow. No one looked back. Daniel Hayes stayed until the last, his face gray under the harbor lights. His voice clipped as he told his crew to stand down. When a reporter shoved a recorder under his chin, he said nothing, just kept walking until he disappeared behind the gates. By evening, the debate had ignited. Talk shows filled with voices clashing in small, boxed-in windows. Was Samantha Cole reckless, too determined to get her shot, or had the sanctuary betrayed her, selling an illusion of safety in waters that were never safe at all? Former trainers came forward, their words edged with bitterness. Ragnar's name surfaced again and again. He had a history incidents that had been rewritten, scrubbed, buried under corporate polish. One spoke of a time he rammed a skiff, another remembered the way he would single out divers. They knew. One trainer said flatly, they just didn't want anyone else to. Biologists spoke colder, almost clinical. This was not madness, it was instinct. He was asserting territory, testing boundaries. Humans crossed them. The animal didn't forget. Their words were replayed, dissected, argued. Some nodded grimly. Others accused them of stripping away sympathy. Outside the gates of Pacific Horizon, people gathered anyway. By the second night, the chain-link fence was covered with flowers, rain-spotted photographs, and rows of candles trembling in the ocean wind. A picture of Samantha, auburn braid falling across her shoulder, camera slung at her side, was taped to the gate, her smile bright against the gray. Strangers touched the image as they passed, murmuring prayers, apologies, words they wished could be carried out to sea. Daniel finally appeared on the third day. He stepped up to the microphones only once, hollow-eyed, his voice cracked from nights without sleep. "We thought we understood the line," he said. "We didn't. That was all." He stepped down, ignoring the swarm of shouted questions. The silence that followed his words spread wider than any explanation. The crowd hushed, the only sound the faint rush of the tide against the pilings. And a question settled in the air, heavy, unanswered. If the wild has rules, who broke them first, man or beast? Weeks passed, and Monterey Bay seemed to forget. Tour boats left the harbor each morning again, carrying families with cameras and coolers, their voices light and eager. Gulls returned to their endless circling above the docks, their cries sharp against the salt wind. The sea lions barked from their wooden rafts near Cannery Row as if nothing had ever disturbed the rhythm. To a stranger, the bay looked healed, as though the surface had smoothed over every scar. But at the Pacific Horizon dock, one place still carried the weight of that morning. The railing where Samantha Cole had last stood bore marks no one bothered to polish away. Salt crusted its edges. Rust spread like bruises across the metal where desperate hands had slipped. Tied there now was a single bouquet of wildflowers, damp from the spray, their colors fading into the gray air. No plaque, no official sign, just that quiet offering. Daniel Hayes came alone one evening, after the tourists had gone, after the crews had tied off their boats. His steps were heavy on the worn boards, the wood groaning under his weight. He stopped at the railing, resting his hands on the cold metal, staring out at the water. The ocean breeze stung his face, sharp with salt, cutting through the silence. He did not bring flowers. He brought only himself, hollow-eyed, the lines on his face deepened by weeks of questions without answers. The bay shimmered under the sinking sun, golden light stretching across the surface in ripples. From shore, it looked peaceful, but Daniel knew better. He had seen how quickly peace broke, how beauty sharpened into violence without warning. Somewhere beneath that surface, the sea still held her story. He felt it in the weight of his chest, in the ghost of her voice carried by the wind. Ragnar never came back. The scarred fin that had haunted those waters was not seen again. Some said he was gone for good, vanished into the deeper Pacific, beyond the range of any boat. Others whispered that he was still out there, circling unseen, waiting in silence. Daniel did not know which was worse, that he had disappeared, or that he might return. He spoke aloud, his voice hoarse against the emptiness. She came for beauty, and it took her. The words scattered into the wind, unheard by anyone but the sea. His hands clenched the railing until his knuckles whitened. The horizon bled red as the sun dropped, the color spreading across the water. It was the same shade he had seen bloom beneath Ragnar weeks before, soft and horrifying, impossible to forget. Daniel looked away, but the image was already inside him, etched permanent. Around him the bay carried on, families laughing somewhere down the pier, gulls crying, waves folding against the shore. Life continued, but it continued differently. The sea does not forgive, Daniel thought. It does not perform. It remembers. And now, so would he. The pier lights flickered on as the sun bled out behind the hills, their glow stretching thin across the salt-stained boards. The smell of brine lingered sharp in the air, mixed with the faint rust of the railing no one had bothered to scrub clean. A single wilted flower hung there, its petals curled and brittle from spray. The harbor was noisy again, gulls calling, engines coughing to life, but every sound felt too loud, too careless, like they had forgotten. Daniel stood still, one hand brushing the cold metal where hers had slipped, his breath shallow in the chill. The sea rolled on, wide and unbroken, as if nothing had happened, yet everything had. Some said the ocean heals, but that scar on the dock remained, and as the horizon turned the same red he had seen in the water. One question stayed. What do we truly remember when the sea decides to take if this story stayed with you? Share it, talk about it, and join us to keep these voices alive.